Hello, everybody. Welcome to the stream. This is becoming a habit. I did this once. We had a thing where I was like, "Hey, I want to interview somebody about a game. Let's make them come on my Twitch channel," and it just keeps happening. And I would like to thank Matt Colville for continuing to make this happen. Look,
I'm happy to be here.
Guest. So, Matt, for people who are not already familiar with your mighty bodies of work, would you like to tell us a little bit about who you are and why you might be here?
I'm a writer, a designer. I started in the tabletop industry in 1997 at a tiny little company called Last Unicorn Games. I worked on the Dune collectible card game. I was a writer and designer on the short-lived Dune role-playing game. We did two different systems for official Star Trek, the RPG books. I was a designer on the second one. I did the Starship combat system for that.
Nice.
I wrote a whole the introductory box for the Lord of the Rings RPG called the Lord of the Rings Adventure Game. Then I jumped ship, went into video games, worked on Mercenaries 1, Mercenaries 2, a game called Evolve that I'm still incredibly proud of. I was a designer on the first two of those games, and I was a lead writer on the last two. Evolve was the first game I ever worked on, and the way my career has gone, it may be the last actually, where I was the lead writer. And we got to create an entire science fiction universe from scratch. I don't know if we'll ever get that opportunity again. That was pretty special. And then we started a YouTube channel. I started a YouTube channel.
It's the royal we. It's you and
you got
the mysterious internet.
I like saying we just because it makes it feel like this collective effort that we're all.
I do precisely the same thing, and I don't know where I picked it up, and I don't know when it started happening. But I'm like, today we'll be doing this, or today we're playing this game. And I'm like, no, I'm playing it. You're
even
not,
when it's literally you,
literally just me. Yeah.
But I mean, if it was literally you, there'd be no audience. There'd be no reason to do it.
Right.
So you do feel buoyed. You do feel like the audience is part of the process. So I always say that. So we started a YouTube channel about, largely predicated on the fact that all the people I was running D&D for that I had met in the last 10 or 15 years would not then, even didn't matter how much fun they were having playing the game, it would never occur to them to run. And when I would confront people that I thought would be good dungeon masters, they go, "Oh, I could never do what you do. That's crazy." And I was like, "It's really not that hard, and it's a lot of fun." So I said, "I need to make more dungeon masters." That was literally what I thought. I need to make more DMs. How can I do that? I'm going to just start a YouTube channel saying, "Look, it's not only is it fun, it's actually pretty easy. It just the job of the dungeon masters make it look all like it's esoteric and ineffable to make it seem like we are always speaking ex cathedra." And so that did really well. The YouTube channel did really well. And then we did Kickstarter and to make a supplement to Dungeons and Dragons about strongholds and building strongholds and the rewards you might get for building a stronghold, which harkens back to a style of play I have a lot of affection for from the 1970s. And that's something we can talk about, is the difference in styles of play and the idea of fashion in D&D.
I feel like you're filling a niche that a lot of people have never had any access to. Like, when I play D&D, I don't know how I hit it big because at 9th level, I don't get to roll for my followers and stuff anymore. So I'm like, well, what do I do now? Like, I just...
I mean, the core different editions of the game have handled this better than others, but it's definitely right now, I believe, the thing you're doing at first level, fighting monsters, is basically the same thing you're doing at 15th level, right? And I think 4th edition, because it had different literally like scales of play, you had like eventually there was epic level play, there was heroic something, and epic level play had better guidelines for, okay, now you should be dealing with cosmic powers.
Right.
You start off trying to save the village, then maybe you're trying to save the country, then later on you're trying to save the world, right? And so there was in the original version of the game, you built a stronghold when you hit about 7th or 9th level, and the reason you did that explicitly was because now it was time for you to worry about politics. Now it's time for you to stop worrying about killing orcs. You can still adventure, Richard the Lionheart managed to run a country while he was adventuring. That wasn't a problem for him. But the idea is that you start caring about more important things than just dungeon delving. So that's the thing I'm trying to bring back. And the Kickstarter did, it did pretty well. And so there's a whole lot of people who that's how they know me, like, and why not? Or the YouTube channel is how they know me, and they didn't have any idea who I was as a designer or a writer before that, and I don't know why they should. And so that's how we are here now.
That's the life story. Well, I was trying to think, and it was good. You did an excellent job summarizing your entire career. Good job. Curriculum vitae in 30 seconds. Yeah, I was thinking about this because I was like, all right, when was the actual first time that I interacted with Matt Colville? Like, what is the origin story there? And my first thought was like, as often happens on the internet, people who are fans of one thing become fans of the people who are connected to that thing. And so I have overlap with lots of other D&D people. And I think somebody tweeted at me like, hey, you should check out Matt Colville's stuff. I think you guys would be, you'd have some interesting things to say to each other. And, you know, I liked your YouTube video. But the more I thought about it, I think the first time that I interacted with you indirectly was you were making games when I worked at a game store.
Yeah.
So
yeah, you certainly stalked some of the games that I worked on.
My interactions would definitely have been with your works, ye mighty, before we got to the point where the internet was a thing that made people who play Dungeons and Dragons famous enough to have intersecting fan base.
Famous.
Yeah. Famous. I mean, it's a word that has lost all meaning. So
yeah.
I think from what you were laying out there, I want to jump right on something right away. That idea of like your design of your new book of Strongholds and Followers, solving what you perceive to be a gap in the design space in D&D. Because for me, being familiar with older editions and older versions of D&D and that style of play, it feels like there was something that was there, and then like losing a tooth. You're like, wait, wasn't there something used to be in that space? And so it's cool seeing that return. What about that style? Like, why do you think that has changed? Like, why are we where we're at?
I think that Wizards of the Coast specifically, this is very kind of inside baseball stuff. And I used to work at Wizards of the Coast. Like, they bought the company I worked at. And although we were never in their office, so I say I worked at Wizards of the Coast, I didn't work in their office, so I didn't really work there, but I had access to a lot of the knowledge of what was happening. And this would have been about 2001, I think, 2002, literally right when third edition came out. I think they have internally, starting in around 2000 when they bought D&D, they have identified what is the brand of D&D. And the brand of D&D is basically fighting monsters.
Yes.
And so things that fall far outside that, they're like, well, if you want to do that, that's fine. We are going to focus on fighting monsters. And that has impact on me in a couple of ways, because it's the reason warfare has never been core and never will be core to Dungeons and Dragons.
Yes.
There will never be a core system in those 3 books for how to resolve large combat. There may be a paragraph or two where it's like, okay, well, roll a die and make it a skill check or something, but it'll never be a system. And that's not because they're dumb. It's not because they couldn't do it. It's because they have identified that as being outside the core brand.
They're very, very different narratives, right? Like the idea of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table wandering Angle Land, like fighting the Saxons and what have you, is one type of story. And then the king on his throne commanding his armies is a whole other type of story completely. Yeah,
it is. And it's a fantasy. Furthermore, this is something that is a hard fought lesson on my part. I definitely have that fantasy of commanding armies and being a duke. I think that's super cool. I, as a player, love to do that. But in the 20 years that I would foist upon my players this kind of stuff, what I learned was only about 1 or 2 players at the table in any given campaign actually want to do that stuff. And the rest of them, and it took a lot of me trying to put myself in other people's shoes and me trying to have empathy for these players that aren't happy. I eventually learned that if you showed up to the table to fight monsters and everything that comes from that, all the amazing storytelling, I don't mean to in any way demean fighting monsters.
I don't think we need to expend time and breath on excusing D&D's core play values. Like, people know that they're good. We don't have. It's okay.
Okay. Yeah.
Wizards has enough self-esteem. We don't really need to be like, we're not trying to hurt your feelings, Wizards of the Coast.
No, but I don't want people watching to think that when I say the game is about killing monsters, that I'm somehow saying that there's, as a result, it's not also about story. I think the two go very closely hand in hand. Although I have a highly developed ideas about what it means to call a game a storytelling game and whether or not D&D is one of them. The players apart from the 1 or 2 players who who like that fantasy, the other ones often find it distasteful. Mm-hmm. They're like, what is this peanut butter doing on my chocolate? I'm allergic to peanut butter. And I'm like, oh shit, I thought everybody liked this. No, I'm wrong. Not only do they not like it, they're like, get that out. And so eventually, 4th edition, I think, cracked that nut and made it so that my warfare system is simultaneous with an encounter. It happens while you're fighting the armies at the gates, while you're fighting the leaders of the army. And if you don't want to command an army, you're literally just playing D&D, and you can ignore all that. It becomes opt-in. My warfare system is opt-in.
Unlike actual war, you get to decide whether you go or not.
Correct. Yes. Yeah. Well, that's what makes it a fantasy. And what I've discovered is many players who historically would not have been interested, that helped kind of onboard them, because they're like, well, my turn's over, and we have a couple of units that haven't done anything yet. Screw it. It'd be stupid for me to. And then they start commanding the units, and then they start engaging with the combat. So when it wasn't this style of play I was enforcing on them, and it was just a thing you can do if you want. If you don't want, don't worry about it. Then they were a lot more okay with it, and it became a lot more. It instantly became a much more successful system. So warfare and having a stronghold and influencing the world politically are two things that I don't think any stewards of D&D since TSR have really thought was that important. And even back in the original game, they did think it was important. They just assumed that you would have your own rules for that, and they would say, yeah,
it makes sense, because you're seeing a game that in its own way, like, evolved from war being the default, right? Like this is a game that came from Chainmail, which is a tabletop war game. And so why would you want to go back to that? We already did that. We came from that place. So if you're sitting there,
a lot of those guys had that stuff.
Right.
They had it, and it was like, and so if they wanted to do it, they had these other systems. And so when I was coming up in the 80s, it was typical for every DM to have their own system for when it says here in the book, at 7th level, a fighter gets a keep. Every DM had their own system for what that meant. And that was, part and parcel of being a dungeon master back then. And one of the things I love about 5th edition, hats off from my point of view to Mike Merles, is that they have developed a system, he and Jeremy Crawford have developed a system that is incredibly easy to house rule. And the result is people house rule it. People do now make up. So it's my hope that if people get this stupid book I'm working on, if they get this book and they're like, oh shit, this isn't really what I wanted, that they do feel empowered to then, at least now that they've got one answer, they can come up with, when you have no answers, when you have no idea this can't even be done, I don't think you work toward it. But once you realize, oh, I could house rule something like this, then you will.
Yeah, well, and I think that's the difference between leaving this massive design void and just saying, like, make it up yourself, versus saying, this is a way to do this. Because I think every player and every group of people that play Dungeons & Dragons, or any role-playing game, really, if you played it long enough, you start finding the stuff that rubs you the wrong way.
Yeah.
And
well, that's where fantasy heartbreakers come from, right?
Yeah.
I'm going to self-publish my own game, take it to Gen Con, and it's super important that my game is different from D&D, because my elves don't have pointy ears.
Yeah, that's or like, I don't use Vancian magic. Everything else is exactly the same, but spell points though.
Yeah. Actually, you said something on Twitter that I thought we could talk about, which is how much you hate the using. Is it even Rule 0? We're talking about using Rule 0 to excuse bad design.
Yeah.
And say, like, hey man, if you don't like it, you can just change it, which is sort of what I was just talking about. If you don't like my book,
well, so
hopefully,
there's two things that get conflated, I think, when I talk about Rule 0 or the Golden Rule, right? It's this, I associate it with the, like, White Wolf era game advice versus the Gygaxian, like, you can make up your own rules because you're the GM, you can do whatever you want, you're God. So those two things get conflated a lot, but the thing that I tend to refer to is this, like, unguided empty space where the rule book says, either very early on or as secret advice to the game master, like, guess what? None of the rules actually matter. Like, the story is all that matters. And if the rules get in the way, just throw them in the trash and say whatever the coolest thing that comes to mind is. And like, that to me is really, really lazy design. And it tries to cover for the game being bad.
And I think your point is, correct me if I'm wrong, that you feel like it's a cover for bad design. That it is a thing that people say to excuse the fact that they're not actually designers, they're really just writers.
I think, intentionally or otherwise. I think some people think that it's a good game design principle. I think some people think that, like, giving the GM this thing is empowering them in some way, instead of just like taking their parachute away and throwing them out of the plane. I don't think anyone, like, I'm not gonna go out there and say, like, Justin Achille made up the Golden Rule to cover for Vampire being bad. I'm sure that the team thought they were doing some really good game design, and some bits of it are, and certainly it has a place in the design space. But I also think that it's often used to say, well, if you don't like this rule that we wrote for whatever reason, go ahead and just make up your own. Because
that gets to the question of what is the purpose of rules in a role-playing game.
Right.
What is the purpose of rules in a role-playing game? And I think I have an answer, but I don't know if there's like it's the shared language that we need in order to communicate and make the game move forward. And then
Right.
if you really did feel like you didn't need the rules, it didn't matter what the rules say, you could just make stuff up. What's going to happen is if you really followed it, you would end up with a bunch of unhappy players, because they would never really know what the hell how is the DM going to rule on this, because he's constantly just making it up. And having any rule set gives us an objective, because it's written down somewhere, an objective language that we can use and depend on to make decisions in the game.
Yeah.
And that I like that. I do like that Gygaxian version. I actually tend to be a Gary Gygax apologist, which is something I never thought I would be doing. But that notion of like what he meant was design your own stuff. Design your own thing. Like don't just throw it out and replace it with nothing.
The thing is, I think that Gary Gygax was a better game designer than he was a person capable of communicating what he actually meant. Because I think that if you read the Dungeon Master's Guide and you
which
look
everybody
at it,
should, that first Dungeon Master's Guide is incredible. There's a Gygaxian is a term in the dictionary now.
Yeah,
meaning
right.
The way that dude wrote, because they needed to invent a word for the way this one guy wrote.
Yeah, the first edition AD&D Dungeon Master's Guide is, I think, the text of Gygaxian literature, right? Like if you read it, there is this way that he is trying to impart things that we've found better ways to say since then. But there's the thing that gets caught up in the whirlpool of Gygax is it's about authority, right? He's a very like, the GM has 99% of the authority in the game, and the other 1% is split between the rules and the players. Yeah. And so what I think we end up with is this mythologizing. It goes back to what you were saying about what makes being the GM seem so scary, is that Gygax set the GM up as this godhead figure, right? That like you will have infinite ultimate power as the game master. And for most people, I think looking at that as outsiders, it's like, I'm not ready for that. I do not want that. That sounds terrifying. I don't want to have to be responsible for everything. Let someone else be a god. I just want to fight monsters. And so we all try to like defer this responsibility because it's so pumped up by this Gygaxian super myth of the game master, to the point where I think that he had a bit of an identity crisis, where he was like, well, I wrote these rules, and I'm perfect and amazing, so the rules have to be perfect, except the game master is also perfect. He gets caught in this circular logic thing where it's like, the GM is God because I say they are, because I'm the ultimate authority, but then the GM is, and but so it can get caught up.
I also think that we suffer because we are reading stuff that dude wrote over a course of 20 years.
Yes.
And that when he was the head of TSR, and trying to get people to buy his products and not other people's products, he said very different things than he did when D&D was the only game in town. It was just this thing he and his buddies made up, and they were selling it. And,
well, yeah, you compare the way D&D gets talked about in interviews in the sort of early 80s, the kind of high TSR era, where Gary's talking about D&D, versus like the early shit in Alarms and Excursions, right? Where it's just like, hey, here's this game me and my friend Dave made. Go ahead and make up your own stuff for it. That would be cool. And it really mimics the way that sort of the indie tabletop space and like small press tabletop stuff feels now.
Oh, sure.
Where you look back at that, the Alarms and Excursion stuff, you look back at those old articles, and it's like, oh yeah, this is just like small press game designers talking about a game and like hacking each other's work and stuff. And then at some point it became a business. And then, like you said, it shifted, and Gary was like, no, everything else is substandard product. Yeah,
you're not really playing unless you're playing with our product. That's where a lot of the language he gets criticized comes from. It's when he was shifting away from being a game developer and into being a businessman and trying to. I'm always super impressed. This blew my mind when I got a chance to read the 3 little brown booklets that my friend Jim Murphy brought to game night one night, where like one of the first things Gygax says is, he's like, listen, man, sooner or later your players are going to be like, hey, can I play a dragon?
Right.
And he's like, yeah, if they ask that, say sure, yes. And that notion, which I mean I think every dungeon master goes through that phase. Every game master goes through that phase of being like, well, if it's not in the rules, then no, because the rules are what they know, and the existence of the rules gives them safety and gives them this feeling of, if I follow these instructions, then I am being a dungeon master or a game master. And what Gary was saying was, wow, what's really important is like empowering your players to have fun. That's what we're here for. And so if they ask this question, just say, tell them, but then try to make it so that it's You're not like a, you're a baby dragon or something
And
like
that's
that.
well,
I'm
and
like,
that's where
this
you
is great advice. This is incredibly good advice.
And that's where you run into the problem that I think game design needs to solve, right? Because if you get into a situation where one of your players says, I want to play a dragon, and you're like, okay, cool, we can work that out. I can make that happen. But one of your other players is, if he plays a dragon, this will not be fun for me anymore, right? And you're like,
because I'm just playing a dude.
Yeah. And so suddenly, and this is why, whenever I hear game designers talk about design, whether it's video games or tabletop or whatever, designing for fun, I'm like, just stop trying to throw fun out the window, because everybody's fun is different. And my fun might be slogging through the muck and suffering as a character, but your fun might be being a fantasy superhero, and the rules need to fit either both of those things, or one of us needs to change according to the game that we're playing. We all need to buy in and agree with that, because there's no one rule set that can be designed to be fun for everyone. Like, it's just not possible.
No, and that's one of the reasons I feel bad. And I find it's a strange position for me to be in, because I definitely, having gone through the 90s and having played, dozens of different role-playing games and really gone down the story is all that matters rabbit hole, I have since spent the last 15, maybe longer, being like, you know what, D&D is basically the only game I need. I can run everything. Everything I want to do, I can do in this framework. I now find myself in the position, especially on Twitter, seeing these people who they watch. I think Critical Role is the patient zero for this. They watch Critical Role and they want to do what those guys are doing. But Matt Mercer is, this is not obvious, I think. I don't think this is obvious if you watch Critical Role. Matt Mercer is a war gamer. Mm-hmm. Matt Mercer plays, by the way, he plays War Machine, which I think of as being a very complex game. I don't know if you're familiar with War Machine, but it's supposed to be ostensibly cheaper and easier than Warhammer because you need fewer units to play. So therefore it's cheaper. However, each unit has like 3 Magic the Gathering cards of text with all its different special abilities. And as a result, War Machine ends up being quite a complex game. And so that's where he's coming from. He's inculcating that kind of wargaming light, right? When they do a dungeon crawl, there's maybe 3 rooms. It's not 6 levels and hundreds of rooms. But he's inculcating that D&D, which of course I love. D&D is negotiation, role-playing, investigation, fight. Fight. And there's always going to be a fight. And there are people online, I'm watching people online who are like, but with the fight though, does it have to be? Right? And you're like, you know what? You probably don't know this, but there's a shitload of games out there that have wildly different solutions, if any, for that fight part. And I should do something with Matt. Matt and I should do something like this where we talk about like all the different fucking games that are out there for people, because there's definitely some. There's a dial. And that dial has incredibly fine control over it, and you can dial in whatever kind of narrative experience you're looking for.
And that's the thing that I think for me is a really big pet peeve in role playing games, and I definitely think that Wizards of the Coast and Critical Role by extension have encouraged this mindset that D&D is the only game anyone will ever need for anything, and that you can do everything. Every kind of story can be told by slightly adjusting Dungeons and Dragons in some direction or other, which is patently false. Like, you can do a lot with D&D, certainly, but you can't do everything.
I think it might be true, except that you're still, I think you could tell any story you wanted inside D&D, but some of those stories would not have a whole lot to do with the rules you were
using. So I guess that's what I mean. Like this is sort of like, I think that this is something that the OSR kind of latches onto, this idea that if it's not in the rules, the players are expected to just bring it themselves narratively and work it out outside of the rule set, which I don't think you can. I don't want to give D&D credit for that. Like, if I play a game if I play a game of Dungeons and Dragons and it's a space-faring intrigue game in which no one ever draws a sword or casts a fireball spell, we're not playing Dungeons and Dragons, right?
Sure, no, I get that.
If you don't engage with the rules, you're not actually playing the game, and so I don't think that Wizards should get to sell copies of their game based on that when there are other games that can support the players.
I get that. And I think there's a difference between like the setting and genre. Right, I think you can do a swashbuckling science fiction story in D&D. It just wouldn't be ray guns and rocket ships. You can do a Wild West game in D&D. It just wouldn't be 6 guns. But it's when you get down to, so definitely, obviously, D&D doesn't handle any of that stuff. It's when you get down to, well, I really want to run more of like a soap opera style game, but yet my dungeon master a couple of times a session expects me to want to care about armor class.
Right.
What does armor class have to do with General Hospital? Is General Hospital an obscure reference now? I don't know. But
I mean, I know what that is, but
so you get it, right?
I
Like,
understand. Yeah.
here are still these game mechanics. Here are still these assumptions. Fighting monsters. 1/3 of the core rule book is about monsters, not about like plot points or NPC development. And so if the dungeon master often feels empowered to tell lots of different stories, like it's the players who end up shafted because they're like, I don't want to fight monsters. And there are games out there like 10 Candles and stuff, and that don't really have anything to do with fighting monsters or combat. And people, when they play it and the light goes on, they really like it. And so that's what I hope that people understand, is that while I'm sitting here as somebody who can play D&D literally for the next 30 years and not feel like they're missing out on anything, it's other people I feel bad for. It's other people who don't come from that tradition.
I'm fine. It's the children that are wrong.
They're not wrong. That's my point.
No, I understand.
These folks deserve their own game. They deserve to be able to enjoy. They're watching, for instance, Critical Role, which I watch, which I love. They're watching the show. They love the show, and they want that experience. They don't realize how closely interwoven those monster fighting rules are to that, and they don't know that it can be unfucked.
Yeah.
And I know that bugs Matt. I know that he talks about it. He's like, when he does other streams, he loves doing other streams where he's a player in someone else's game and it's not D&D.
Right.
So there's other stuff out there.
Well, and that's the trick, right? I think that like there's this halfway point, and I think the DMs Guild is a space where this is either happening already or is going to happen more and more, where people will try to be like, this is the soap opera supplement for 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons. And here's some new soap opera focused classes. And like, here is and it's like, you're halfway to a point where you should just throw out what you're doing and make another game that's just those rules. Game. Yeah. Cause
just find another game or go make another game, because there are lots of games out there. And you can, and that's something that I think about as somebody who is, like I said, steeped in this culture and perfectly happy here in my warm hot tub of D&D, that I don't want other people to feel like they've got to jump in this hot tub because this is the only one. It's not the only one. There's lots of games out there, and you can custom tailor the experience for yourself.
Yeah, well, and I think it sort of speaks to like understanding the difference between, like you said, sort of setting and genre, or setting and theme. Like you can, and I've seen lots of people do this, even published, like you look at the difference between published campaign settings, right? Dark Sun and Eberron and Spelljammer are all still very much Dungeons and Dragons settings. They tell Dungeons and Dragons stories. They are about the same things D&D is about. And that's why I think they fit. But you start to get into things like Birthright and Ravenloft, and you need to start bending the rules to the point where you're at that tension point where the rules are they're white hot and they're ready to snap because you're pushing them so hard to try to make the story work with the setting.
And like when I remember when I love Birthright, by the way, and it was my favorite setting. It was my favorite.
Of course it was. Like look at the book you're making. Like yes, no shit. Yeah, thank you 100%. For that enlightening piece of information.
Back when I was playing it, and other people, because like you, especially when you came up, because you're about 10 years after me. D&D in the 90s was seen as a kids game. Like grown-ups didn't play D&D. What's wrong with you?
Right.
And people would say, well, if that's what you want, why don't you just play Pendragon? Right. Like they would be like that was what I would get. I would get when I would say, oh, I'm running Birthright. They would be like, why would you use D&D for that? Why not use this other? And they would argue much better system. But the 90s was definitely a time of storytelling being primacy over monster fighting.
In it's paying lip service to story, not actually like engineering it, right? Like, because this is the thing when it comes down to, like, I hate this divide. This is a divide that I am. It's very much something that came up as part of my like game design learning space, like as a result of things like the Forge and like this idea of like
Ron Edwards'
a story game, right? As being an independent thing from, like, I don't know, I guess a role-playing game, which I think is a horseshit distinction, because I think D&D is absolutely a story game in the sense that all role-playing games are about fundamentally ending up at that point where you're like, we can tell the story about the game that we played. Like this is a thing. We've told the story.
You just said something I think is super fucking important, by the way, because this is something I think Craig Robinson, one of the folks that follows me on Twitter, I think it was him, who said that when I said I don't think D&D is a storytelling game because I'm a game designer. That's where I'm coming at it from. I'm coming from no, if I wanted to sit down and design a story for telling a game for telling stories, it would have Act 1, Act 2, Act 3. Right. Okay, well, roll to see how the protagonist, is this a reversal? What's the inciting incident, right?
Sure.
What was that would be what it would be about. And there's none of that in D&D.
No.
And he said to me, D&D is a game. And then as soon as you're done with that session, that's when the story begins. It's not a storytelling game at the table. No one's telling stories at the table. They're rolling 20-sided dice to see if they can beat the armor class.
Correct.
Storytelling starts as soon as we're in the parking lot 5 minutes later.
Right.
And we spend the next 3 hours. It's like, I thought we stopped because we were tired. And we just spent 3 hours in the parking lot at 1 o'clock in the morning telling ourselves the story.
And that's completely the thing that for me changed the way that I look at role-playing games is there's a distinction between the narrative, which is the term that I use to describe the ongoing imaginary things that are happening at the table. I swing my sword, the orc takes some damage and falls down. I jump over the orc because now in my mind, in the narrative, he's lying on the ground. We all agree on that. The story is later when you're like, remember that time that I jumped over that orc? Like that's the story. And you don't tell those. Like, that's not
that has all the rules of story. That thing that happens in the parking lot has all the rules of storytelling. If you want to play an actual storytelling game, go get the Baron Munchausen role-playing game.
Right. And there's board games and card games that help you. They say like, it's your turn. You make up a character. You're making up the protagonist now. You make up the antagonist, and you follow the rules of sitting down and writing a story. But Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games, there are places where you butt up against those two things, right? Where there's a little bit of that kind of like liminal space between them. But for the most part, I would say that role-playing games are a distinct thing from a game that encourages you to take turns telling a story.
Correct. I remember seeing like in Feng Shui, which had mook rules, which is sidekick, not sidekicks, the guys in the background, the nameless, faceless guys in the background. And there was a rule that was, if any of the players ask, "Hey, what's that guy's name?" Right,
they suddenly like gain levels, and
they go from being a 1 hit point dude to being, and I was like, that is the beginning of treating the game by the rules of storytelling,
right?
And by the rules of narrative. It's a very tiny thing.
I love that stuff. I absolutely love that stuff because I think that the idea that we, first and foremost, the idea that we differentiate between like a story game and a role-playing game is not a helpful distinction. It just alienates people.
I think you're probably right. I think you're probably right. But when I say I don't think D&D is a storytelling game, that's me being a very noodly designer nerd.
Sure.
And it's not me trying to. That's the reason I get in trouble when I say that, is because people feel like I'm disparaging this thing they love because it has so much to do with story. Anyway,
no, totally. Yeah. Well, I think
it's a false dichotomy. It's a false dichotomy.
Right. It's the same as the dichotomy between like this game is like story focused or rules focused. It's like the rules help you create the story you will tell later after you're done playing the game.
Yes.
But I think the other thing that you can do is that I think understanding what makes an interesting story, not just as a GM, but as a player, engaging in this game makes you better at it. And this can be at the design level, like in Feng Shui, or even in a game that's like incredibly crunchy. Like I remember reading GURPS for the first time. Reading the GURPS, one of the GURPS like GM books, not the main book, but one of the compendiums. And in it, there's a set of rules that say, if you would like your game to feel like an action movie, here are 6 rules that will do that. And one of them is called Imperial Stormtrooper Marksmanship Academy. And the rule was that no NPC will ever hit a PC on the first shot. They will always miss the first shot to warn the PCs that they're there. Then the gunfight can begin. And I love that understanding of what makes something feel interesting and cinematic, but not just applied all wishy-washy at the table, but applied through the rules.
Through real rules. There's a real, very quite crunchy rule set in GURPS.
Yes.
And Feng Shui had one too. And now we're going to layer on top of it actual rules from narrative, actual like screenwriter stuff that we would learn, none of which is in D&D, by the way. But that screenwriter nerd stuff of, okay, at this point you're going to have a reversal at this out of the frying pan into the fire plotting, and all of the things we take for granted depending on what genre we're in. Like you could very easily have rules like that for Westerns. About how the characters are allowed to behave based on what we know. Mechanics for how the players and the characters the NPCs are allowed to behave based on the rules.
Well, and that's what Pendragon did, right? That's sort of Pendragon's big thing, was that like you have to act like a knight because that's what the rules say. You're not allowed to be a pirate or a samurai in Pendragon because you have, if you wanted to be, if you wanted to hack Pendragon to be about pirates, you'd have to change all of your virtues, right? Pirates don't care about
that's
chastity,
true. They don't have
right?
no, exactly. There's not. They don't have the 7 knightly virtues.
Yeah,
They
you
don't
could very easily
it's not a game
do
about chivalry.
you could very easily do Pendragon as a samurai game by replacing chivalry with Bushido, right? Like it's not that.
But you couldn't do a pirate game.
Right.
You would be dumb. That would be dumb. But reading Pendragon, you could design your own. You could go,
right.
What are the virtues of being? Yeah. So that's the kind of stuff that I hope people understand. As I sit here, perfectly happy, I could talk about D&D and the design and the history of it for weeks. That there are nearly infinite. I remember we were just at my new office. We just got our new gaming table assembled. So we inaugurated it last night with we played games. And when we were leaving, I've got stacks of RPG books sitting around waiting for shelves. My friend Tom was just like transfixed. He was having like a liminal moment at some random book. And I walked up, I'm like, what is he looking at? And he was looking at the In Nomine. He was looking at the In Nomine Infernal Player's Guide and the art on it, which was insane. And I had to explain what In Nomine was, and that there was a time when there was an entire role-playing game, and a moderately successful one, I think, where you played angels and demons and had a completely different rule set, and the dice you rolled with 3 6-sided dice. It was a 666 system. And, you know, that stuff is out there, and the combat wasn't that big a deal in that game. And, you know, I just hope that people understand that, like, you don't have to try to find your fun inside this one edition of this one game that Matt Colville happens to love. There's a bunch of other nonsense out there.
Well, and I think that's the thing, right? Is that when I say Burning Wheel is my favorite role-playing game, sometimes people hear D&D sucks. Like I form different words with my mouth than sometimes end up in people's brains. And I think that's a product of this sort of very cyberpunk dystopian world that we live in, where brand loyalty is personally reaffirming.
I get the same thing when I say a D&D is not a storytelling game. That's ridiculous. I get angry because they feel like I'm saying that the thing they love is bad. And it's like, and I wish people wouldn't think that, because obviously that's not what you mean, and that's not like you are quite evidently steeped in the history and culture of you are one of the writers and designers of Dungeon World, which is this crazy love letter to D&D.
Well, it's the opposite is true too, where like if I say this other game that I like is good, and you hear D&D sucks, then what do you hear when I say D&D sucks? Like you're not hearing that part of my conversation either. Like I think there's nuance to be gained from appreciating a bunch of different games, or like knowing what's good and what's not good about any given thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And also just knowing like what that it's okay to like the same game for different reasons. And it's like, so that's it's, I think that just as we're seeing this explosion in interest in role playing, which I largely credit to Critical Role, because of the way they show that, like, anybody can now watch this show and go, oh, is that what it is? That looks fun. It's my hope that we see a lot more different and interesting games start to come out to cater to people who want to have that experience but don't necessarily want to fight monsters.
It's really interesting if you look back at the history of role-playing games and think about kind of what could have been. There was a period in the mid-90s where TSR was going out of business because of mismanagement and some bad decisions on their part. They were at this point where they could have fallen apart forever. White Wolf was a big deal. Vampire was huge. And people in the popular culture were saying things like, oh, rock and roll is over. Techno is the new thing forever. We could live now in a world. It is very possible. There's an alternate reality not too far from our own where Dungeons and Dragons died and games like Vampire became the predominant paradigm. And we're all listening to Moby and like being excited about being Clan Ventru.
That's true. I remember when I started in tabletop, one of my coworkers, and he had been in the industry for a long time. I was a complete newbie. He described, I'm about to jump 2 or 3 points ahead of what you just said. So
Sure.
I'm going to have to unpack this statement.
Yeah, please.
He described gamers as mouth-breathing morons.
Okay, sure.
And this is somebody who made games.
Right.
And that's what I associate with the 90s. The 90s were this era of, we aren't designers, we're writers. and that these are works of art that we're making that are meant to be read. And
Right.
who cares if they play them? These are the White Wolf, and I got this sentiment from not everybody, obviously, but at least a couple people from 1990s White Wolf, that like the worst thing about the game they were making is that there were people out there who were playing it. They wish it could just exist as this brilliant piece of literature, right? That was changing the culture and was empowering goths and empowering outsiders. By the way, those are excellent things to do, right? But the fact that people play, because that was still a time when rolling dice and kicking down the door, rolling dice, and fighting a werewolf instead of a dragon was considered déclassé. It was considered this. It was the high art of what we were doing in the 90s was the storytelling stuff.
It's that awful.
Like, this is so schizophrenic.
It's that awful nested shame thing that happens with nerds sometimes, where it's like, well, I'm not a dork. I like Star Trek, not like those Star Wars nerds. And the Star Wars nerds are like, yeah, well, at least I don't like Battlestar Galactica, okay?
Yeah.
And there's this.
You can agree that Battlestar Galactica,
yeah.
And that is one of the things that has always upset me, because kind of the thesis statement of my channel, my YouTube channel, is that everything that was ever popular is still fun for some people. It's just not fashionable anymore.
Yeah.
And it's stupid to think of that way they played back then as being somehow degenerate, and they weren't really having fun. No, they actually were having a lot of fun, and there are still players out there like that. And if they only knew that this kind of game existed, they would be having a lot more fun. And that goes in both directions, by the way. It goes both in the terms of focusing more on role-playing and narrative and character and plot. It also goes in focusing more on combat. I remember my friend George Vasilakos, who runs Eden Studios and a big comic book store in Albany, New York. When the first time he showed me, because I'd never heard of it, Warhammer Quest, he said, when this game came out, my friends and I stopped playing D&D because this is all we wanted. Right. And I was like, oh my God, I couldn't believe that. I couldn't believe that there were people out there who were like, but what about all the cool fucking storytelling and all the cool, and suddenly I found myself being a storytelling defender in the D&D group. But it was an eye-opening moment, because I was like, oh, of course, that the spectrum goes in both directions, and it's all good and it's all fun, and that there are games out there for everybody.
Well, and that needle of popularity moves around a lot too, right? Like, I remember watching people in the sort of indie post-Forge like space rediscover Moldve, right? And be like, wow, this is an indie game. Like, it does.
It really is like
it does one thing. It does that one thing really well. And it gives you rules for doing the one thing. It's a hyper-focused, small game without a ton of rules that just does dungeon crawling and literally doesn't care about anything else. Like, if you look at Mulve and you're like, what happens if we leave the dungeon? Old Tom Mulve is like, nope, I don't care. Go talk to Cook. I think he's figuring this shit out.
I feel like Tom Mulve is like the Nick Drake of RPGs, where he is this unsung hero that influenced so many people that came after him. And when you discover his work, you're like, wait, Pink Moon, what? Where's this been all my life? Where's this been all my life? And you suddenly see all of these different antecedents that branched out from him. But he wasn't Gary Gygax, he wasn't Zeb Cook, he wasn't any of those guys. And so if you're a certain kind of D&D nerd or a certain kind of historian of the game, you absolutely know who Tom Moldvay was. Yeah. But when you go and like, a lot of people think that the rules cyclopedia is like the best edition of the game ever, and that's all they need. And a compilation of all that stuff. So I don't know. Yeah, I think that this is a fantastic hobby, and there really is something out there for everybody. It's just a question of whether or not they get the chance to find it, or whether or not they feel like there's only I spend 99% of my time talking about D&D. So people are going to think that's the game. But there's a lot of stuff out there.
It's a tough thing, because I think that, people ask this a lot, and we talk about it in terms of like Twitch. So I run four games a week, 4 campaigns a week. I do a Burning Wheel.
How is Far Verona going?
Yeah, I do a Burning Wheel game. We do Far Verona, and then I do two D&D games. And people are like, why do you play so much D&D? And I was like, well, okay, like, it's a good game. But mostly, it's not because I love D&D enough that I want to be playing it 2 times a week. There's a bunch of other peripheral stuff that makes it the thing to play, right?
Sure.
It's going to get you. It's going to get you the audience. It's going to be familiar to people. People can tune in, having learned about games like RPGs from Critical Role, and they can be like, oh, hey, this is a new thing, and you can build your audience. This is why most people who stream role-playing games on Twitch just stream under a D&D. It's contributing to the Kleenexification of the game.
Which I don't mind. Of course I don't mind it. But I learned a lot about, when Evolve came out, I learned a lot about streaming, and I learned a lot about how people follow really personalities more than they follow games. And so a lot of these streamers, they're gonna stream Fortnite because Fortnite's popular, not because they like Fortnite. Maybe it's still a fun game, right? So it's not the end of the world, but Fortnite's what's popular, so they'll stream Fortnite. I remember I was crazy in love with a 1990s tabletop war game called Vor, made by FASA. And my friend Jim, who is old school wargaming, was like, wow, this is a really well designed game. I love this game. And that, for me, that was a huge blessing from my friend Jim. But then every time he was playing anything anywhere, it was always Warhammer. I'm like, but this is a terrible game. Why are you playing this? He goes, because this is what everybody plays.
Right.
And so if I want to get in a game, I can get in this game. And in the context of that, it's fine, was his attitude. It was like, I agree with you. I agree with you. But in the context of I get to play games and hang out with people.
And that's something that I hope that we can do away with eventually. And this will be a thing that will negatively impact D&D, I think, not on a grand scale, because I think Wizards is going to be top dog for a very long time. Yeah. But this idea that we play whatever is around, right? Like I definitely have played bad games because that's just what the people I knew wanted to play. It's the books that the GM owned, and I could not find another group to do something more interesting. So I was like, all right, I can try to make this thing fun. You know, if you can't be with the one you love, you gotta love the one you're with. So sometimes I know it's the worst, but sometimes
what a terrible thing to say.
Right, yeah.
You can only say that if you're an incredibly rich white dude in Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young, and you're just like, why would I get married? Yeah. Like, when I could just sleep with all these girls. I'm gonna write a song.
If you can't have the thing you actually want, well, suck it up and just take whatever you can get, I guess.
That was so that's such a weird
in terms of role-playing games, like that's very much a thing where people are like, I hate my group, my GM's an asshole, I don't want to be playing this game, but I live in a tiny town, I don't know anybody else.
That happens so much. So many people I knew or I met in video games, because it's incredibly easy to get into video games and never play any tabletop. Yeah. Like, you came up through Nintendo, like you did not ever play tabletop games. So many people I've met, probably hundreds of people at this point, who they bought one or two cool looking RPG books. They weren't D&D books. They were some other awesome looking thing, and they knew nobody who played.
Sure.
And that's kind of tragic. But now we have the internet. The internet makes it so that if you have a little bit of entrepreneurship, you could make a game happen online with whatever game you want to play.
Yeah,
we were going to talk about Authorial Voice.
We were, and this is actually
just keep going forever.
This is actually a good segue, because I was going to make a joke about Nobilis, which is
in a game in which the dungeon master is called the Hollyhock God.
That is it's the best name for a GM ever, the Hollyhock
Which I am
God.
90% sure. That's not John Sneed's game. Whose game? It's whose game was Nobilis? I'm 90% sure.
There were different developers for different games, but it was a Jenna Moran, Arshawn Borgstrom thing for Nobilis.
Yeah. I always thought that was them deliberately taking the piss out of Dungeon Master.
I think so too. I definitely think so.
What can we do to make sure that no one ever mistakes this game for a game like that? Yeah, Nobilis was kind of a flag that people waved at a certain era when they were trying. They were trying to make a hill that was not the D&D.
When I worked at the game store, I worked at the Century Box. That was the game that everyone would like talk about, but no one had ever played. They'd be like, "Oh, I have that," and they'd be like, "Have you played it?" No, of course not. No one has. But I think that's a thing that is going to go away. I think that's going to fade, because you can now find at least 3 other people on the internet who will play.
The internet makes it possible. The democratization of technology makes it possible for anybody. If you want to play this, you can just go online and say, I'm going to run this game. Who wants to play? Definitely Nobilis is nothing but Authorial Voice. And I'm a big believer in Authorial Voice because I've seen it work.
So for folks who may not be familiar with the term, when we talk about Authorial Voice in role-playing games, what are we talking about?
Well, we talk about the fact that when you read this RPG book, you are aware of the author, and you are aware of the author's not only their existence, but their point of view and their attitude. Mm-hmm. And that is something that comes out in the text.
Yes.
And this is traditionally anathema to role-playing games for good reason. And that is, 99% of the time, that's a number I just made up.
Yeah, it's a good number. It sounds like a big, impressive number.
Yeah,
I'm impressed.
Quite often, the purpose of a role-playing book is to be a reference manual, where you are just trying to find the rule you need. And in that capacity, it needs to be clear. There can't be any authorial voice. It needs to be well indexed. You need to be able to quickly get to the rule you need. And if it says it's on page XX, you go there and you're like, I got it. And authorial voice is a threat to that, because it means I've got to wade through a bunch of the author talking in order to find the text I need. But for me, I think that is worth it. I think it's worth that, because the flip side of that is no one ever learns role-playing games by reading them.
No, it's true.
They learn role-playing games because their older sibling played. They saw it on Critical Role now, thank God. Thank God for Critical Role. They can watch that show and go, oh, I get it. I have a basic understanding of how this game works. Now I can just look up the rule when I need it. And they never actually sit down and read it from cover to cover. Good, because you can't. That's not how they're meant to. They're written as reference manuals.
I have definitely,
they're not written as books you read.
I've definitely been in positions where I have, for the purposes of a review or whatever, sat down with a role-playing game and read it like front to back, word by word. And it's very difficult to do. It is
not, because that's not how they're designed.
It's a challenging thing.
It's designed to, those role-playing games typically, especially D&D. Most other games, the way they differentiate themselves is by making themselves not feel like a reference manual. But most role-playing, like Traveler, I don't know if Stars Without Number is like this. I have it, but I haven't read it. Where the goal is the player knows what the player is using the book to get to the rule they need. How do we make it as easy to do that? But I was working on the first role-playing game product I think I wrote from cover to cover, which I still see, by the way, in game stores every once in a while. It was the Lord of the Rings adventure game. It was of all the stuff we were doing, this was the one that was going to end up in Barnes and Noble. Right. So, and I saw this when you walked out of the movie in the mall and you went to the Barnes & Noble, there was my game that I wrote as the introductory. It's the red box. It was the red box for the Lord of the Rings RPG. And I wrote it with heavy, heavy authorial voice. I used me, you. I said, your players are going to want to do this. That's a terrible idea, but there's nothing you can do about it. Right. And so you not only did you hopefully get the rules, you also got my attitude, my personality, and my boss was like, this is your project, man. We'll see what happens. And the layout artist who was responsible for dumping the text into it is actually my aforementioned friend, George Vasilakos, said to me, and this had a huge impact on me. So thank you, George. He said, Matt, this is the first role-playing product I've read from cover to cover.
Right.
Because you could read it. You could read it. You could read it from beginning to end.
The thing about that, though, is that depending, I mean, you have context that this is a person you know and you know what they mean, but that could also be, I don't know that I would necessarily uniformly accept that as a compliment, because I think that to a degree,
because authorial voice is an attack on a reference manual.
Well, so I think
it's harder to find the rules you need. That's the reality.
We have several variations of how authorial voice kind of makes itself known in a role-playing game, right? Yeah. Like you can see throughout the history of RPGs, authors or groups of authors struggling with this, where there's the sort of Gygax authorial voice where he's like, I'm writing the Dungeon Master's Guide because I'm the god of Dungeon Masters and I'm imparting my specific godly advice to you. You need to understand this because I'm smarter and better than you. Which is like, fine. Okay, you wrote the book, Gary, and that's great. Cool. That's his authorial voice. But it's throughout the book, this kind of slightly patronizing voice. And then moving towards this kind of like awkward, and I would love to be able to cite the first book that ever did this, and I hate it in books, but the in-character like contextualizing of setting stuff in the rules chapters.
Shadowrun does it.
Well, so I'm talking about this as differentiated from chapter beginnings, right? Because White Wolf had the comics.
I know exactly what we're talking. Is that there's like is this an R-rated stream? Can I use adult language?
Please.
What's the RPG where they used a British euphemism for cunt as the term they used in the text to talk to players?
Oh God, I know the game you're talking about.
Burke. It's Burke.
Oh, it's Planescape.
It's Planescape. Burke is short for Berkshire Hunt, rhymes with cunt. You drop the part that rhymes. And so they're walking around in this game, and the text would say, "Listen up, Burke. This is blah 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 blah." And like it was written like this is Tolkien did in The Hobbit, and it's something that children's book authors do on purpose, is they talk directly to you, because that way it feels like, it feels like your mom or dad reading you a story when you read The Hobbit. And that's how they wrote that book. So they literally had a character telling you the rules of the game.
Now I think that's different from, so what I'm thinking, because that's definitely a thing, and that's you see that in Paranoia, you see it in Apocalypse World.
Yes,
this idea.
God, I love Paranoia. Right. Paranoia is a great example, by the way, of how Matt Mercer loves promoting other games.
Yes,
because he ran a Paranoia game. He played in a Paranoia game, I think, and Paranoia is very, very different from D&D, by the way.
Yeah, I 100% associate Matt and that game. But so what I'm thinking of is this thing where there'll be like plain kind of vanilla rules text, and then a sidebar of like either direct commentary on that rule from an NPC in the game, right, or side conversations with NPCs, or this kind of in-character like, oh, yeah, I'm a dwarf, I'm going to dwarf explain this rule to you. Like, dwarves love fighting with axes. And you're like, okay, but I just read the rule. I don't need you to like flavor it up with this side text. These kind of like, I'm reading from the author of the rules, and then like 3 or 4 NPCs. And I think for me, the game that like
that's abusing the privilege.
I couldn't read Dresden Files, the RPG, because it is just like drowning in that. The whole book is like that.
I get that, because it's getting in the way, and that's something I'm aware of, because I Strongholds and Followers, the book that I'm working on, is full of me talking to there's literally a point where the header, because one of the 4 strongholds you can get is a keep. There's keep, tower, temple, and establishment. And there's a footnote that's going to be in the book under keep saying, there is a great, by which I mean deeply weird, movie by Michael Mann called The Keep. And I get to talk about that. So there's my point of view and my attitude all through the book, and that makes it harder.
Yeah, like
to find
I want to quote.
It makes it more likely that you're going to read it.
I want to quote you. This is the thing. You sent me some
oh shit,
Strongholds and Followers stuff, and I love this. No, so this is a line that jumped out to me when we were talking about Authorial Voice, and I was just like, I love this, because I think that it is, you can hear Matt's voice in this text. It is pure editorial on top of the rule material. So it's under the setting for power, with an exclamation mark, not merely power, but power exclamation mark. And it says, strongholds unbalance the game. I mean, it's not clear to me the game is balanced in the first place. It's like, that's perfect. It's so good, because you're not imparting first party like information about the setting or the material. You're imparting something to give people context for your approach to the whole rest of the game. It slightly bends your understanding of the way you can trust or not trust the person telling you this information, which in this case is Matt imparting the rules of the book.
It also requires me to have a lot of trust in the reader.
Yes.
Right. And that is something that I feel like I can get away with because of the YouTube channel. I feel like there's a lot of people who are going to get this book who know how I talk, and I can get away with it. I probably wouldn't do that otherwise. But yeah, that notion of that trust goes both ways, is that they have to trust me. If you keep reading, this is going to make sense, which is not something you have to worry about in a normal role-playing game. The rules are meant to be clear and explicit, and not have this. I don't think you get the right to write that way in your very first book ever when no one's heard of you. Like I do not think that if this was the first time that anyone was ever accessing your material, I would say this would be a bad move, right? I completely agree. And it's like I mentioned how I wrote the Lord of the Rings adventure game with Authorial Voice. But I want to make it clear, nothing like this.
Sure.
That was much more me just who you was, and the fact that I was talking directly to the dungeon master, which rules tend not to do. They tend to say the DM, the player,
or when the rules do directly address the dungeon master, it's with this obsequious bowing and scraping tone where it's like, well, my lord might like to use this rule if my lord would like. Like that's a tonal shift that when I feel it in a book, I hate. When you get to the GM chapter and suddenly it's either like, all right, now those fucker players are gone, let's do the real shit. Or the inverse, that like, oh, well, I have a private audience with you, mighty game master. Let's do this thing now. I'll give you the secret rules. Yeah. Like it's I think strong authorial voice it's a dangerous implement, but when it's used well, it's really good. But again, it goes back to that thing, like using it well, it segments your audience.
Here's the virtue of just writing a reference manual
Mm.
is that you don't have to worry about losing your audience. I mean, you have to be a clear writer. You can lose your audience because you couldn't write things clearly enough for the players to understand it. But once you bring authorial voice into the mix, now people are going to judge the author.
Yes.
Now people are going to judge your attitude toward the players, toward the game. And I think that's one of the reasons people deploy authorial voices, because they want you to know their opinions on things,
Yeah.
especially that kind of 90s design where they had, it's just an extension of that 90s game store where the owner of the game store bought the store because he wanted to preach and,
oh
and
my God.
tell people, and this is just the RPG version of that. Exactly. I wonder how many people understand what I mean.
I really
exactly what I'm talking about.
I've been to Gen Con enough times, and I've gone to the like buy one get six free booth, and I've read games who are entirely written in the I know better than you, so I wrote a game voice. Yeah, that was in my limited experience and my limited and heavily biased experience, that was very much the 90s. That the author was the I know better than you, or actually we are better than they. Mm-hmm. We read, you who are enlightened because you bought this book, we're automatically better than all those people who don't know about this book and are playing something dumb like Dungeons and Dragons. And that kind of factionalism, I mean, I hate that. I hate people who try to make themselves popular at the expense of putting something else down. It's hard because it sells books. Like
it can, yeah.
It can, like, if you do it,
what's fashionable, yeah.
If you can catch a zeitgeist and you can you can understand like people who are vulnerable to that particular kind of marketing, which is say like most people, and leverage it in the right way, you can really sell a lot of copies. Like it's 100% a thing.
Yeah, but it's I think it's toxic because it creates this us versus them attitude. And
well, that's why
that really made me sad. It really made me, and then it's weird because in the 90s it made me feel like this isn't for me. And then the crazy thing was it was D&D that saved that. D&D's like, man, kicking down doors and killing orcs is fun. Don't overthink it. And I was like, yes, I agree. All of these things are fun. Do we have to say that one thing is fun and the other thing's expensive?
Well, I'm so curious to see the new edition of Vampire. Because all of the interviews that I've read with the people developing it, that's the attitude that I feel dripping off of it. Like there was an early interview by the director, whoever was responsible for the new Vampire game, and the whole thing was just like, everyone who used to play vampire is an idiot. Everyone who plays D&D is an idiot. We're cool and tough. We're making a game about being an edgy vampire. And I was like, well, oh my God, this is going to be a train wreck. So I'm really hoping that they've moved away from that, but that very, very much feels like it's going to be the way that they move into it, the way that's marketed. And I'm really
well, that was my impression of the game back in the 90s, was that, like, except obviously they didn't have the people who used to play Vampire part. It was that I remember I think I found, and I posted a video, I believe I have a first printing of that Vampire the Masquerade game. And when that game came out, they did not know what kind of game they were making. They didn't know they didn't know what success they were going to have. So it wasn't until the second printing of that first edition that they went back and put in like references to the
you can really see changes
from like, there were quotes in that first Vampire the Masquerade book from like Foreigner.
Yeah.
Right. Because that's the stuff those guys were listening to. And then it caught on with goth culture. And they're like, let's make sure and so, I mean, that stuff was there. That goth stuff was there in that original book, but it was a much wider, they were casting a much wider net back then.
Well, and that's the thing. Like I talk shit about White Wolf's design a lot, and I stand behind. I think that it doesn't achieve what the game sets out to achieve, but you can't argue with their ability to market a product, to understand a demographic, to bend the product to fit that demographic, and then to make bank right off of that.
Yeah, there were a lot of there was certainly, when I was in college and in the years thereafter, there were certainly a lot of people. They definitely succeeded in getting people who weren't interested in D&D to play role-playing games, and that makes me happy. So that's I think it's all fun. I just don't like the idea that we have to promote ourselves at someone else's expense.
Yeah,
that's all.
I agree. And certainly that wasn't like, there was a lot of people that worked and have worked at White Wolf, and they certainly don't all have that opinion as people, but the game did have that going on for it. And it was certainly an aspect. And the Authorial Voice was a part of that kind of like, welcome to the cool kids club. Like, come on in. You've joined the Camarilla. You can leave your +1 Baldric behind.
That wasn't just by the way, like a tactic. That was really how those guys felt and thought. They were the guys that held the first and then became annual rave at Gen Con. The White Wolf party was handing out ecstasy at Gen Con in the 1990s. That was real. They really were like, we're the hip kids. We're not war gamers. And I'm one of those people who is like, I love the hip kids. I also love the war gamers.
Yeah.
So that factionalism is the thing that kills me. But yeah, that was White Wolf really were those guys. So
yeah.
Anyway, yeah.
Yeah, it's a whole thing. So it's, I mean, this is the thing, like culture of games and the games themselves are interlinked, and you cannot separate them, right? There's the people that played and make the games and the games themselves. And I think that way that voice comes out is a way to impart the culture of games and impart the stuff you're trying to say about a game. I think for me, the biggest interaction that I've had with Authorial Voice in sort of a design space is with Apocalypse World and with Dungeon World. So Dungeon World, I think, because Sage and I both wrote it, but because a lot of the sort of flavor stuff, a lot of the description of monsters, a lot of the kind of more voiced stuff comes from me.
Right.
Like I can look at it and I'm like, oh, this book is written like I was describing something to a person, or I was just like explaining something or whatever. Like this, I can feel my own voice in that, and I think that that's something that other people can pick up. But the game was intentionally written to be relatively accessible because our audience was people who are familiar with D&D, and we did want to do a little bit of that, like this is a slightly not edgier, but a slightly more like voiced version of D&D.
Yeah. But which is good because I think that's what engages a reader. I think that engages the reader. And it makes it a book that people will, in my opinion, if you're not D&D, where you can sort of get by assuming there's some osmosis that's going to happen, I think you need authorial voice to get the reader to the point where they're a player, to transform somebody from being a reader into a player. You can't just assume they already know the Apocalypse World rules and therefore here's my skin to it. You're like, no, we're gonna walk you through this, and we're gonna write it in such a way that it's engaging with the hope that you read it, because then there's a better chance that you'll play it.
Well, and I think that some of that is what contributes to the success that we've had with Dungeon World, is that it was voiced to be more accessible, because Apocalypse World is very strongly like Vincent Baker's Apocalypse voice. Like it's written in a way where to some folks that might make it harder to read or might make it unclear. Certainly it polarizes the audience in one way or another. It either says like, you like this, which I did. Yes, I love the voice in Apocalypse World.
As soon as you are in your game that you're writing. Yeah. You just lost some people,
right? Because they don't like the way you talk.
Because they don't like the way you talk. They don't like the point of view. They don't like you, or in some cases, it's because they actually just want to know the rule, man. Mm-hmm. Don't give me the personality or the attitude.
I feel like.
So how is Far Verona? If you don't mind me switching,
sure.
This is more of a segue. How is Far Verona going? Because the stuff you're doing with it really excites me.
I am having so much fun, and
I can tell.
It's weird because when I think about Far Verona, so Far Verona is the Stars Without Number campaign that we are running. We're running on RollPlay. It's our current RollPlay campaign, and it is paired up with a multi-user RollPlay thing on Discord. So in Stars Without Number, there's a faction turn that the GM uses to negotiate all of the big movers and shakers in the world, the church and the government and the noble houses and everything, and how they conflict with each other. And I took all of the factions and I turned them over to our fans, and everyone could join a faction, and we played this big game. And what's funny about it is that it's been running for like eight weeks maybe now, at the time of our recording this, and I feel like the faction stuff is the game for me, and the tabletop is like the show based on the game.
Yeah,
right. Like it's
a show based on the game. Sure,
it's not the other way around. It's not, to me. I don't feel like the Discord stuff is supplemental to what's actually on screen. I feel like the on screen is an opportunity for me to show off the cool stuff from the Discord and from the multi-user game. On like I can highlight it for 4 hours once a week. So it's really been
well, it makes perfect sense. So here is what's happening. Here is the way the world wags and what wags it. Mm-hmm. And then now we're going to play the people who have to live in that world and deal with the reality of what the faction turn is doing. So of course the faction turn is going to start looking like the game. The faction turn is the thing that's happening. The tabletop game is people dealing with that reality. You did something that you enfranchised the players, or I'm sorry, you enfranchise the viewers because now people can join factions, correct?
Yeah.
And the things that they do influence the faction turn. And I thought that was super cool. And if I can find a way to rip that off, I'm going to.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I mean, all I'm doing really is large scale diplomacy.
Well, that's the thing.
With a multi-user dungeon sort of.
I am actually literally going to be, I believe, my next Dungeons and Dragons campaign, which we're going to stream, is also going to be actually a game of real diplomacy.
Yeah.
Where there's going to be 7 people that I've chosen to run the movers and shakers of the world. And they're going to have a map of diplomacy, and they're going to be playing diplomacy. And the people watching the stream aren't going to see that. They're just going to see these characters in the city trying to deal with their nonsense. But then every month or whatever the turn ends up being for the diplomacy game. And so I was not surprised. I was a little delighted and happy to see that you were basically doing the same thing.
Yeah.
Right. I don't know how explicitly you're using the diplomacy rules. I don't think you are.
No, I'm not. I'm basically just giving so each faction is made up of several hundred people, and I'm letting them decide how they want to govern themselves. But once a month, basically, I say to their representatives, I'm doing the group has a caller, just like in Moldvay, and the caller gives me the orders. So each of them, so I'm only really interacting directly with like 13 people, and those people are giving me the orders for their faction, and then I once a month on stream carry them out, and we all get to watch.
So it's not a I think most of the people in chat are fans of yours. There may be fans of mine in chat who I'm going to act on their behalf and ask questions.
Yeah, please.
About. So it's not like a democracy. It's not like you, Adam, just put up a straw poll and say, all right, all you 700 people who are in this one faction, what do you want to do? How are callers selected, and how do callers poll the electorate?
So I explicitly went in with the intention of I do not care. Like all I require from you, each faction, all I require is that you give me an order. If you cannot get your shit together in time to give me an order by the deadline, you lose your turn.
Yeah, you pass. Yeah.
Get your shit together as fast as you can. So I think that there's a little bit of in-character stuff going on. And this has been fascinating, is watching the types of people and the kinds of conversations that form in the faction based on the character of the faction. Like if you go into the channel, into the channel for House Lyra, and House Lyra is the sort of culture, they're part death cult, part musician art, like the goth artists essentially. And if you go to their channel is just full of aesthetics posts. It's like, here's a song I love, and here's a bunch of fashion that we think is really cool, and it's very much like that. That's what their channel looks like. And then if you look at House Reticulum, and they're the sort of weaponsmiths of the Empire, you go to theirs, and it's all just gun porn and talking about swords and they.
Now, why do you think that is? Do you think it's? I imagine the answer is both, but do you think that's because people who were into that stuff picked this faction so that now they're doing that? Or do you think we're all just nerds, that faction sounded cool to me, but because it's the weapon manufacturer faction, now I'm going to talk about the weapons and games that I like and stuff like that? Which comes first? I think
it's self-selection and reinforcement, right? Where you're like, I'm going to pick the house that sounds the coolest to me based on my predilections in story.
Got it,
and then once I'm there, we all have that thing in common. We're all members of the Acre Corporation, or we're all members of the UPC or whatever. And we're going to have these conversations about the things that we're all interested in. We can start there.
Makes sense. Yeah.
And and so that's been really interesting. And they've all organized themselves in different ways. I know some of them have councils of members. Some of them have a rotating speaker. The Houses Minor is a collection of smaller factions that I'm treating as one faction. So it's the biggest faction because it's made up of several smaller factions. And so those smaller factions have their own governing body, and then they put someone up for the Houses Minor Council. And then the Houses Minor Council have somebody that comes to me as the representative. They have their own Houses Minor Senate live stream that they do, where they follow senatorial in character and out of character senatorial behaviors to come to decisions. There's all kinds of supplementary material around this, and I get to watch, and I just watch them populate the world and answer questions, and it's fascinating.
I just smiled, and I feel like you're doing what you're doing with your campaign, and I'm hopefully going to do, it's already kind of started, doing what I want to do with my game, where there are different factions and there's a lot of diplomacy happening, because I wonder if it's because both you and I are trying to get back to 1979 Avalon Hill Dune.
Right. I mean,
right. If we're both trying to get back to that ideal that we have, that you and I perhaps uniquely have, of the Dune structure, the different factions,
yes,
different pillars of the Imperium, and the politics and backbiting and the personality of House Atreides versus House Harkonnen versus
100%. Yeah. The tone of the game is interesting because the faction turn stuff is all Dune. It's very Dune inspired for me.
Yeah.
But then the at the table game is very like Blade Runner, right? They're like hunting down artificials there. Yeah. And so I get both of these things that I love in different regards. And I don't think Blade Runner would work on the large scale, just like I think Dune struggles on the small scale, right? Like I think that it's hard to tell the Dune story in that way.
I tend to agree. I think there is some swashbuckling adventure in the actual Dune novel. There's guys like Duncan Idaho and Gurney Halleck, but you rarely get to see them do their thing.
Yeah, the book's about Paul, right? So it's
and politics and family and stuff like that. So yeah, I definitely think that's a great match. That's a great schism. And when you've got that Dune structure, the politics and the factionalism, and to me, this is something I've told every game company I've worked at. I felt like there was a missed opportunity, because if you can make a game that has between 5 and 7 distinct factions that have different iconography and heraldry and personality, then you're going to have a hit game, because people want that, that sport team thing baked into it's baked, at least in America, it's baked into our culture.
Well, it's Harry Potter, right? Like everybody wants to know what house they belong to.
Right? Yeah. And they want to talk about which house they belong to.
It's the alignment. It's the alignment meme over and over.
I call it factional. I think alignment's a very poor implementation of it. Yes. But I think
but it's the same thing.
It is. You're right. It is. You're right. And it's funny because I don't know that a lot of people know this, but alignment was invented to stop players backstabbing each other.
Right.
Because law and lawful was the players and chaos was those guys. And when the first time a player backstabbed somebody else in one of Gary's games, the other players were upset by that because they didn't think that was fair and should be possible, and they invented this us versus them rule.
Right.
Well, sorry, this is the lawful team and you just acted in the chaotic manner. But yeah, if you can do that, I call it faction identification. If you can do faction identification in your game, you are going to sell a lot of copies, because people want to put that patch on their shoulder. People and
for me, what I think is giving people value for their $1 or whatever for the Patreon is that they can not only be a part of that thing. You don't just get to be part of the Deathless fan club. You get to, as to whatever degree feels comfortable for you, you can engage with that tribe as a unit and say, like, wouldn't it be cool if this were a thing that were true about us?
It has to do with, this is how there's a company called Riot. They make a game called League of Legends. One of the reasons it is so
you may have heard of it. Yeah.
Is because, I say that and it sounds like I'm being facetious, but when you're talking about things wild, like I guarantee you there are people playing D&D right now that don't.
Oh, sure.
And one of the reasons they have had the success they've had is because they allow the player to pick the character that represents them and customize that character. We can talk about gameplay and all that stuff, but customization and peacocking.
Oh yeah.
Peacocking, like being able to show off that thing that you spent some money on maybe, or spent time grinding to unlock, but you feel like it's cool and it's personal expression. The faction you join is personal expression. It's the way and it used to be as a player, but what you're doing is you're now making it so it's the way the viewer customizes their experience. They customize their experience of watching your game by choosing a faction, and that allows them to personally express themselves. And that is, I don't know if I've seen that you can do that with like Game of Thrones.
Well, it's hard to do in a role-playing game because everything's in your mind. You can't sell imaginary skins for your fighter, right? Like I get to describe my character however I want. And I didn't have to pay $9.99 to describe my plate mail as being studded with diamonds. Like that's just a thing.
Yeah, that's the thing that factions let you do is like, I describe my character. I've customized my barbarian hero, but you're not looking at my barbarian hero every time you look at me. I don't get to do that peacocking thing of showing off the decisions I've made. It's not about the things you've unlocked. It's not about the money you've spent. It's showing off your personal customization and what it says about you. And that's what the faction turn does, is it lets the viewers show off that part of their personality that they feel like is House Lyra, for instance.
Yeah, and it gives them investment in the universe because they have, to some degree or another, built it themselves. It lets them play a character in that world. And for me as a GM, it gives me it's one thing because I think a lot of people were like, "Well, how are you going to keep up with everybody making all this stuff?" And I'm like, "Well, I only have to worry about 4 hours a week and like what's immediately on screen." So yes, if they go to the planet Honglu, I'm going to go to the 14 Red Dogs triad and be like, "This is your homeworld, dogs.
Yeah.
What did you come up with?" And I'm going to pick and choose and use that stuff on screen. The rest of the value for me doesn't come from having a fully built, fully fleshed out universe, because I don't derive a lot of that. Like, I'm not a big Glorantha fan. I don't need to know the average rainfall of every part of the world.
If you were, you just go play Harn. Yeah.
Right, exactly. But what I can do is it creates a very voracious, very excited audience whose favorite thing to do is ask me questions about the world. Yeah. And 9 times out of 10, I don't know the answer to that question, and so I can make it up on the fly. But the fact that they've asked me is like, oh, I hadn't thought about that. What is the answer to that? What could that be true? Like, so that, for me, is what's really fun about it. In some cases
you can go to the faction, like you said, it's your home planet, guys. You tell me about it.
Yes, and that's it's the Dungeon World, Apocalypse World, like, deference to the players thing, where you're like, I hadn't thought of that. Either I have an interesting answer for you, or no, please, you tell me. Like,
you tell me. Yeah.
I don't know what the titles for your noble house would be. I would love to hear what you think of it, and that'll help you as a group flavor that stuff.
I don't know what these guys' house motto is. Let me go ask the house, and they will tell me. So how would you characterize the difference between a game like Stars Without Number, which is the game you're using for Far Verona, and a game like Traveler? Because they're both sci-fi games.
Yeah. So really, like, and for people who want to know a better answer from the horse's mouth about this, the last time I had a talk like this was with Kevin Crawford. So Kevin gave some insight because I asked him this similar thing. I think it's... Kevin has made a game that is a particular kind of sci-fi that is adjacent to, but not the same as Traveler. Right. In Traveler, it's, I think, to a degree, assumed that you will derive fun from trucking minerals from one planet to another. And occasionally something bad might happen to your minerals, and you have to save the mineral shipment.
Yeah,
but it's Johnstone Metzger refers to that style of play as debt runner, where you owe a lot of money on a thing, and your job in the game is to explore.
It's the Han Solo fantasy.
Yeah, it's you got to pay off the thing by shipping minerals around. But in the premise of Stars Without Number is you are adventurers, you are people outside of society's normal bounds in whatever way. And you are in this sandbox environment, and it's up to you to be successful and to be an adventurer. So it's a little less directed in that way. Right. But I also think that where Traveler, if you just read the core book, is about randomly generating planets and coming up with your own setting. The longer you go into the Traveler universe, the better defined it becomes. There is like an actual Traveler campaign setting that is very, very detailed.
The Fifth Imperium or something like that.
Yeah. It's got all kinds of adjacent humans, like dog people and cat people and fish people.
That's that, which I always thought. I was interesting because I watched that chat with you and the developer, and then I think unrelated to that, thinking about, I've got this office now. Thanks to the Kickstarter, we're able to rent an office and we can stream whatever we want. It was something we designed. We needed to stream 4 hours of D&D a week, but there's the other 7 days we can do whatever. And I was like, God, it would be cool to play. Really, what I was thinking was it would be cool to play a science fiction game. Yeah. And I do have that kind of. I think I am guilty of something you guys talked about, which is fetishizing that old Traveler thing. And when I went online to look, hey, can I get the original? Because they reprinted, like Far Future Enterprises reprinted those little black books. As hardcover.
Traveler is maybe one of the most confusing games to get into, because if you're like, it's like, again, like HeroQuest this way, where you're like, I would like to play this game I've heard about. There's 17 versions by 4 different companies. Which one is the real Traveler?
Yes, it is.
It's like picking
and
the
if you're a
fucking
Traveler
holy
fan, you have
grail.
super highly developed ideas about which ones are good and which ones are bad.
Yeah.
But while the reason I bring it up is because while I was looking to see, hey, can I get those, because they reprinted them and I'd like to get them collected, and I think there are hardcovers, and I ended up on forums about Traveler in which people were talking about how, like, I think Stars Without Number is just better. And they were like, I think Stars Without Number is just kind of a more modern version of Traveler, and it's going to appeal to a broader category of people. And I was like, that was just crazy, because I was just listening to this chat with those guys. And that's kind of, I wonder if you basically can't get away with the strict interpretation of the Han Solo game, where there aren't Jedis and there isn't psionics or mentalics or whatever they call it, and it is just, I've got a small ship and this much cargo, and I'm going to sell it and get a bigger ship so I can have more cargo, which is kind of Car Wars. It's kind of that thing. I wonder if you just can't get away with having to understand hexadecimal,
right?
In order
no,
to
and that's right. Character creation is people always the classic joke is that in Traveler you can die in character creation, but
which I love, by the way.
Yeah, which is great.
Unironically, but go ahead.
But I think that's because there's a thing about original Traveler, and I don't know if this survived, but you are meant to be able to play Traveler solo, like alone.
Oh yeah.
Right. There is a one player variation of it, and that's why you can die in character creation. But the thing about Traveler that I think I bounced off of was, you have to understand how to read hex to make a character.
Yes, you have to do it. Yeah, you have
your stats go up to a point, and then they become A1, B1, whatever. And then also, the chapter about space travel is very much like you have to calculate your deceleration speed, and like there's a lot of math. Which
well, that was back in the 70s when RPGs, science fiction RPGs, were fighting with each other about whether or not they were full thrust, or whether they were whether or not they were tracking vectors, or whether they were Star Wars, and it was just biplanes in space. And that was back then. That was a huge big deal. I think we've largely thrown out the notion of using real physics in our science fiction RPG.
I would say that the connection between Stars Without Number and Traveler, if you're not familiar with either of them, is nearly invisible. Like they're both space games. Stars Without Number uses a 2d6 modifier skill system, and then a much swingier d20 for combat that's straight from Moldvay. And I think that you would not be able to tell that there is a pedigree between the two if you were not already familiar with them.
That's it. I got that impression too,
I have definitely, I can't imagine a world where I would play Traveler over Stars Without Number, because I think everything I can do with Traveler, I can do with Stars Without Number, and not have to do the graphing calculator stuff with it. Because especially with a revised edition, because it does say in the back there are a bunch of things where it's like, if you want the game to be more heroic, here's how to be like Star Wars characters, and here's the rules changes, like we were talking about at the beginning with GURPS, right? It's like, this is how to make it feel like Star Wars. This is how to cut psionics from it and make it feel more like hard sci-fi. And then again, kind of going back to that idea that the GM can take what a game is and modify it to make it fit what you want better. You can change the tables, right? You are given, the setting is in the tables, and you can go in and you can redesign those tables. So if you want to bend the random generation of the world to fit something more in line with your ideas, like go in and cut all the aliens out and replace them with different kinds of humans.
Just
go in
different kinds of humans.
Go in and just modify the tables. Or when you roll something on a table that doesn't fit your version of the universe, like recolor it. Scrape off what John Harper calls the poetry layer, and put on your own.
That's a good way of putting it.
Which
is interesting, because without those, most people don't know, and nor should they, that the science fiction they've grown up with, is a result of these different people in the 50s arguing about different ways in which science fiction should be. Right. And if you're one of the descendants of the John W. Campbell tree, then you just don't have aliens in your science fiction.
Yeah.
And people don't think about that. They don't think about, why aren't there aliens in Battlestar Galactica or Dune or Firefly? It's because they're all descended from this one guy who thought science fiction should be about people and the things that people deal with.
Right.
And that has nothing to do with a completely different tradition than Star Wars. And if you don't call that stuff out, I think players are going to get confused. They're not going to, they don't know those things. So they're going to they're going to get, why are there aliens in this? Do I like it? I don't even know why I care. Oh, well, it's because you like this, that, and the other thing, and you don't know this, but there was a rule: no aliens.
So when I start a game, especially a game like that, where I'm like, it's going to be sci-fi, and I know the immediate next question, whether it's voiced or not, is, well, well, what kind of sci-fi? I always lay out, there's a game called Microscope. At the beginning of Microscope, you lay out all the stuff that's allowed in the story you're going to tell together, right? The game you're going to play, and what is and isn't allowed. You create your palette, right?
Yeah.
And so I did that with Far Verona. I was like, okay, so because I'm the GM and I'm the most invested in this, obviously you can give me feedback as players, but this is kind of where I'm coming from. There are no playable aliens. You cannot be an alien because in my understanding of sci-fi, it's more impactful when we look at what being a human is like as compared to an alien. I don't think that people can necessarily play the kinds of aliens that I want.
Why is that?
I want aliens to be extremely alien. Like I hate bumpy forehead aliens. I want aliens that are like.
It's funny because that's how I run D&D. I run D&D where elves and dwarves are aliens.
Right.
They're not just grumpy people. They're like
which is very different.
Alien points of view.
It's very different from even Tolkien's interpretation, right? Because elves are like sad humans, and dwarves are cranky humans, and Numenorians are.
Well, because he was just reinterpreting these. He was just trying to deliberately trying to reinterpret existing human myths and recontextualize them. And elves and dwarves are things that people told in fairy stories. So I tend to agree. But I also I played a game called Blue Planet. And I played an orca. I played an uplifted orca. And my friend Mark was like, "That's stupid." I'm like, "What do you mean that's stupid? How is that any different from playing an elf?"
It's what I love about Blue Planet particularly, and games like it. So Blue Planet, for folks who are not familiar with 1990s RPGs, Blue Planet is a sci-fi RPG set on like a water world in which you can play. Intelligent cetaceans. It's like, what was that? Sequest DSV. You want to be a talking dolphin? We got you.
Yep. Well, it's basically David Brin uplift war stuff, where human beings have uplifted a couple of species so they can talk.
It's a big precursor to Eclipse Phase. I think.
Yes. If you look absolutely. At it, And so it's always interesting to me to see how players who are perfectly comfortable playing an elf or a dwarf completely rebel if you're playing a Scrode Rider from A Fire Upon the Deep. And it's like and the reason is because they see a Scrode Rider as being alien, but they don't see an elf as being alien.
No,
that's why
what's so weird about that is like if you go too hard, you end up with the Witcher problem, where you're like,
what is the Witcher problem?
Where you end up in a situation where you're like, all right, so there's humans, and then you have dwarves, which are black people, and you have elves, which are also black people. And racism is a thing. But there's only white people in the setting on screen, and they're elves and dwarves. That's how we explore racism, is because of fantasy races. I think that's a weird thing where you end up like losing traction.
I can't even unpack that. I can't even unpack what you just said. That's so weird to me.
Yeah, but that's a thing. And that's a thing in fantasy a lot of the time, where we have this like the other, and we replace it with... I mean, even Star Trek did a ton of that, especially the original series, right? Where
Well, I mean, I think that when you talk about the other in gaming, it's like, I remember, was it Shane Hensley, his business card said, "Everybody loves zombies." And his point was, which I thought was brilliant, your business cards has your design thesis statement on it.
Right.
Your game, whatever your game is, it needs zombies. As we discovered this working on Mercenaries, was we needed... It doesn't matter how complex and all these different factions you could work for, and you'd get in trouble if you joined one faction, you shot the soldiers of that faction. There was always one faction that you couldn't join that you were always free to shoot at. And you were always free as a player to just, those guys, I know I can shoot them. And so I think there is some design use for having the zombies we can shoot.
Well, yeah, and that's the thing, because, and again, you watch the evolution of design, and this even happened like early in D&D. There's the kobold babies in the Caves of Chaos, right? Where on the one hand, D&D is saying like, kobolds are unequivocally, unquestionably chaotic. Civilization, human civilization, and dwarven and elven civilization is lawful. Kobolds are chaotic. They are opposed. They are the enemy. You have every moral right to murder them. These kobolds,
you have free license.
These kobold babies will grow up to be bad. There is no question about that. And then it puts you in a room and it's like, but like you're humans in a civilization that is not D&D, where moral relativism, and so instead you have this situation where you're like, cool, well, our characters would definitely just like stomp all these eggs and murder all these babies because they're going to grow up to be kobolds. But as players, we're like, but they're small and we should love them. And it's
Yeah,
like,
and
but
I think every group goes through that period of, well, maybe not every group now. Maybe we're more enlightened now, but every group back then went through that period of being like, but they're worth XP. And they would be like, yeah, but couldn't we like adopt these guys and raise them and give them names, and then would they be our buddies, right? And I think that is that every group goes through that development phase of taking things on the world's basis rather than the game's basis, if that makes any sense.
yeah.
Like the game mechanics are saying that this is true, but then what the world is presenting me is weak infants that need protection.
Yeah. And that's a thing that we see in games, this idea of like the internal moral structures of the universe versus the external. I mean, honestly, in the first episode of within the first episode of Far Verona, a universe in which we determined synthetic people were illegal and immoral and bad, and
I saw this.
They're not okay to exist, and we need to get rid of them. In fact, the premise of the game is you are playing a group of people who are devoted to the house, whose job it is to keep the law, and the law says this is not a legal person. But I presented them as like they look like a person and they're acting like a person. And your character may or may not believe this, but culturally, that's not a person. It just is pretending to be one, which is in a way more disgusting than it actually being one. And what I thought was really interesting about that is that the player who struggled with it the most, Max, his character, instead of backpedaling, instead of being like, I hesitate, like I don't know if I want to kill this guy, like I'll do it, and then I'll as a player I feel weird about this. He changed his character. Like in the second session, he revealed that one of his goals was like, the system is hypocritical, and like if I'm as a player feeling uncomfortable or weird about this thing, maybe I can just explore that through my character. And so let's make the character about that so that I don't have to play someone who has a very differing moral approach than myself. So he sort of eased himself into that position.
I mean, that's a level of enlightenment, I think. Like that I told I don't think I'm going to enforce this rule because it's more important that you just play somebody that's cool. But the suggestion I gave my players for my next game is to make sure that you're playing a character you can play.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Make sure that you have not you haven't developed a character idea that you think this character is cool, but can I actually play them? Right. And that's something I worry more about now that we're going to be live streaming our game than I would have worried about before. But when you're live streaming the game, I think there needs to be more, doesn't have to be 100%, more of an overlap between the person. I remember one of my players in my last game he had made this really cool character that he liked and I liked, and both of us felt like we understand what his character would do in any given moment, but it wasn't what the player would do.
Right.
And he struggled with that. The whole game.
You can derive fun and tension from that. Like there is a moment where the GM is like, so what do you do? And the player, cringing and struggling, is like, I stab him in the face, I guess. You feel a little pulled along by your character.
I remember talking to my good friend Chris Ashton, who's one of the guys that runs Turtle Rock Studios, and we had both played and loved a video game called Last of Us. We would, as we were playing, we would get together and we would talk about what had happened in the game. And there was a point where you have to, if you want to get from point A to point B, it seems like you have to mow down a bunch of innocent people.
Yeah.
There is a way to get through that without doing that, but it's not obvious. And he's like, what did you do? And I'm like, oh, I killed all those motherfuckers.
Right.
And he was horrified. And I realized the reason I was able to do that was because I was role-playing Joel.
Yes, thank you.
I'm not Joel.
That's how I play video. That's how I play video games too.
Yeah. I knew they did such a good job in Last of Us of making it crystal fucking clear what Joel would do. And I was like, this is what this guy would do.
And but that's the premise of the whole game, right? Like when you get to the end of the game, there is a moment at the end where the game is like, oh, you think you're Joel? No, Joel is Joel. You're just along for the ride. Like you do not get to make that last moral decision.
You don't get to make this last decision, correct? You are going to. It's one of the reasons I'm very glad they're doing a sequel, or has it already come out? And I missed it because I was like, you can't plunge the world into the wasteland. You can have Joel, but then we need Percival. We need Percival to go find the Grail after this.
Yeah.
Because he damns the land in that last moment in Last of Us. And he to 10,000 years of darkness because of his own nonsense. But I do love that that notion that for some players, the character is them. and they have a really hard time. And then for other players, it's like, no, I have no problem role playing this dude
Right.
and doing what this
Well,
dude
and
would
and
do.
I think that in a role playing game, it's different because you create the character, you embody the character, and there are no like you don't have a choice. You always get that choice.
Yes,
And
true,
with
true.
an audience, and I know this is something that in our Burning Wheel game, all of the players, but Blue Jay especially struggles with, where they're all playing kind of self-interested villains. It's a medieval intrigue game, and they're all kind of bad people with their own agenda, and it can be really hard playing a character like that yourself, but also having an audience be like, how dare you? Like, how dare you
Yeah.
make this decision? How dare you make me watch you do this? Which I think is fascinating, but you can also go too far in the other direction into the sort of Nuremberg defensive gaming thing where you're like, well, I'm not an asshole. My character, I can do whatever I want.
Happens. That's one of the classic first things dungeon masters deal with is players using character license just to be assholes.
Yeah, my character's evil, so I stole all your stuff and I ruined your fun.
Yeah, this is what my character would do, and it's like, man, now we have a whole thing we got to.
Yeah, now we got to do this whole thing again. Yeah.
It's so yeah, but that's one of the things that RPGs let us do. That is, so that's cool that like you have that synths, the way the difference between the way synths are treated, which is, I mean, that's you as a storyteller, because you as Adam Coble as a person would be, look, synths are people.
I love robots. I love them. Yeah. I just want synths all of them people to be my friends.
But you as a storyteller, no, I need drama, I need tension.
Yeah.
So I'm going to create a world where these people are being treated like property and force the players to deal with it.
Well, and that for me, that moment was as much for the players as it was for the audience, right? Like I've GM'd on Twitch and making GM stuff as a show so much that now I can't help but think about the audience. And for me, that moment of presenting them being like, here's the thing, here's the synth, which one of you is going to retire it, who's going to pull the trigger, right. And knowing they were going to respond that way, that was for the audience, because I had spent weeks firing them up about how evil the synths are and how they almost ruined the empire, the Crux saved us from what they could have done. And then it was like, okay, here's a moment, let's see in practice what an actual person would do when presented with a human looking individual begging for their life, right? Like, can you do it? Are you willing to? And if not, what does that mean? And what was really fun was watching the players bend their own behavior around that to be like, oh, you know what? I'm going to, like, Anne double down. Anne was like, nope, you know what? Now I understand where we're at. I'm going to play to that. That's my thing. And Max was like, you know what? The nobility is a bunch of hypocrites, and I need to like find a way to exist in this thing while also like working out how to change it. And I think that's really cool.
In order to that moment, even though you could not have predicted it, is why you created that central tension. Right. You created that central tension because you want players to have to start making those decisions. And it's a great central tension, by the way. It's a great axis along which all the NPCs they meet are going to have opinions about this. All the factions they join are going to have opinions about this.
Right.
And now the players are forced to have an opinion about this.
And that's sort of something that I try to do, like with Far Verona specifically, but with games in general. I try to develop thematic arcs of like, what is this game kind of about, and how do the characters and the situations reflect that, right? Like in Far Verona, it's like, what does it mean to be human? And not in the like David Cage sense, but in the like, who is a person and who is not a person, right? I think Blade Runner explores this a little bit. There's a tiny bit of it in Dune where it's like, are the Fremen people or not?
I mean, Blade Runner is all about the fact that like the point of Blade Runner is that the main character is a machine and machines are people.
Yes.
And that you're going to watch Deckard go through this arc of just doing what he's told, unthinkingly doing what he's told the way a robot would. Whereas the robots are the ones that are living life, right, and being alive,
trying to survive,
trying to experience the world and exploring and tasting, and then that he eventually, Deckard, gets to the point where he's a person, and that's the point of that movie. So doing stuff like that in a role-playing game is super exciting. I mean, watching chat, and as you talk about synths, people are espousing the different philosophies of the houses.
Exactly. They're in
a huge success. To me, your game is a huge success because of that faction identification. People are like, it's awesome. It's awesome watching people engage with the content like that, which is something that, this is, we're getting to a point now where for some people out there, if your RPG game is something that only exists for you and your 6 players, you're wasting an opportunity.
Right.
Because there's an audience of people out there who would engage with it and they're missing it. And so I think this is, Critical Role. They weren't the first, but there's going to be this huge sea change in how we perceive what is a role-playing game and what can it do. is that the existence of that audience and them watching these decisions being made and how they identify with things is going to be huge. And the fact that the stuff you come up with, all this work and effort you're putting into this game to create this world, this universe, to create this central tension and put it in front of the players is engaging a huge audience of people.
Yeah.
That's, why would you not do that if you could do that?
Right. Well, and that's the thing. We're gonna see more people playing more variety of games. People are going to get exposed to those, and they're going to play games. We're going to get an audience of people. We're going to get a hobby that is better educated and better understands the hobby they're
100%.
Participating in as time goes on. And it's all going to be because
because it's led by people like Matt Mercer. It's going to be more inclusive. It's going to be more empathetic. It's going to be more positive than anything we had to deal with in the 70s, 80s, or 90s.
Yes. That's the thing I love about Matt is that he's just so like friendly and gentle.
I am lucky to know him in real life, and that dude actually is what everyone hopes he is. It's kind of disgusting.
Yeah, he's not a cynical waste case like the rest of us.
No, by no means. No, in fact, I think one of the reasons he likes me is because I often am the one saying the cynical, like, and
it's nice to be that thing for people to say these things and then let them watch you deal with the blowback.
Yeah. Well, this was a lot of fun, Adam. I felt like we could have talked for a lot longer.
Yes, I feel like that is definitely a thing that we could do again if you felt like it.
Well, I absolutely, but I'm also looking forward to seeing who your next guest is, because I watched the interview you did with the Stars Without Number developer, and I just thought it was fantastic.
Yeah, it turns out a lot of people, I can turn in some of my social currency to get people to come and hang out with me on my stream. So yeah, I'm gonna find some more people, and we're gonna chat about some other stuff.
I'm curious, while I have chat here, I'd like to know what people thought about this and whether or not they thought this was. I guess if you're still here after 2 hours, you are by definition. Yeah, you should have Mark on. Stop flirting, you two.
Yeah, I'm Mark. So Mark and I have been talking about. I offered to go on his podcast, so I think we'll start there.
He asked me to be on his world building.
Yeah.
Is it the same thing? His world building podcast stream? I don't know.
He was after Far Verona started. He was like, I do a podcast thing, and I was like, cool. Let me be on that. I love being on podcasts.
So I don't know if that's going to happen. Me being on Mark's thing, because I think one of us or both of us forgot about it.
Yeah.
So
he's been very busy with his LA stuff. So.
Oh, that's right. He was out here for. That's right. Yeah. Well, good for him. That's cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So like, I mean, this is the thing. Like, I think that there's already lots of people talking about like interviewing game designers about their games, but I kind of want to do more of like this kind of thing where we just like sit.
Well, I predict the next time this happens, you're going to be in Orange County, and we're going to play the Dune the Dune board game.
We didn't even get to that, but yes.
No, but I have the power, and so if you're willing, we can fly you down, put you up in a hotel, and you can come out to the office and make like a day or two of it. We could do lots of stuff. We'll probably have to come up with like a schedule of stuff so you don't get bored. But we're definitely going to film and stream our collective favorite board game. I think is it accurate to call it your favorite board game?
Yeah, absolutely, 100%.
Yeah, is the Avalon Hill. It's so weird that there's been so many interesting advances in board game development and production, but still for me, it's hard to beat. There's never going to be a game that has better ludonarrative harmony than
See, this is why Matt Colville's such a smart guy. Like you're taking the words out of my mouth. It's perfect. We'll do a whole thing. We'll talk all about the Dune board game at a later date, but just know that is something we both collectively love a great deal. Yep. Cool. Well, let me know when that happens. Everybody, thank you so much for coming and hanging out and chatting with each other while we chatted about role-playing games and other things like doing.
Somebody said that's why he's smart. He's like me.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, come on. He's smart like me. Exactly.
Yeah.
Listen, I only have people on who will just ape my own opinions, but I think that's not at all true. I mean, I think the first time, not to digress too hard while we're trying to end the stream here, but the first time we did the roundtable, afterwards, everybody was like, "Oh, Adam and Matt hate each other. Oh my God." Because we disagreed on some points, I guess, which means
but that's the fun. That's the fun of doing a roundtable like that. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, because then when someone is wrong, you can talk to them about why they're
wrong. Well, because like it's fun to find stuff. Like I don't know. I thought there was going to be more stuff that we would disagree with on this stream. We'll have to think about stuff that we don't agree with and argue about it next time.
Okay. All right.
I don't know what that would be.
I'll come up with some more. Here, you tweet about things you like, and I'll find reasons to hate them, and then we'll talk about it.
Okay, that's fine.
All right. Cool.
That shouldn't be hard to do.
Well, thanks for coming, everybody. This has been a conversation with Adam Cole and Matt Colville. Matt, thank you so much.
Thank you very much for having me on, Adam. It was a privilege.
The privilege was all mine. I will see all of you again, if you're watching this live, in like an hour on twitch.tv/DND for the continuation of our Tomb of Annihilation game. If you haven't watched it, it's great. Ooh. It's fun. We're going to go and continue that. And thanks for coming, everybody. Make sure you give Matt a follow if you haven't already. And we'll see you all next time. Bye, everybody. See you.